Hey everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day and thanks so much for joining me for another art video. Something I'm frequently asked about and I see people struggling with a lot when it comes to painting with watercolor is painting white subjects or objects. So for today's video, what I've decided to do was share my list of the top 6 things that I always make sure to do and have in mind whenever I am painting something that is white with this medium. These are the top things that I keep reminding myself of throughout the painting process so that there's a greater chance that I'll be successful. And they all go for any kind of white subject, whether it's an object that I am painting or an animal, maybe a bird that has white feathers, or a dog that has white fur, a white flower like the one that I shared in last week's full tutorial, which I'm going to be linking to down below in the description box in case you'd like to follow a step-by-step tutorial. But these tips apply for anything that's white that I am painting with watercolor, including this little pair of espresso cups that you're seeing me work on right now on screen. And this is just a little monochromatic study of white objects that I wanted to film so that I could better just explain some of the things that I'm going to be talking about. Alright, so before getting into those 5 tips that I want to share with you and I want to make sure that you know about, I want to explain a couple of things that I want to make sure that you beginners out there know about. If you're more advanced and want to jump straight into the tips, I am going to be leaving a timestamp right at the top of the description box right below the video so you can jump straight to that. But if you're just getting started with this medium, I highly recommend listening to these points that I'm going to offer first. The very first thing that I want to make sure that you guys who are just getting started with watercolor understand is that white paint is not even necessary when we're working with watercolor. I don't ever use white paint except when I am working on very specific kinds of effects, such as when I am adding that final snow detail, when I am finishing up a snow scene, maybe a starry sky, though I would prefer using masking fluid for that. But I just use it for very specific types of paintings or effects that I am actually planning since the beginning of the painting process. And for that, I like bringing in white gouache, which is completely opaque. Down below in the description box, I'm going to make sure to also link to a couple of different full tutorials in which I walk you through how I paint snow scenes using this medium and how I add in splattering at the end using white gouache. Now, let me just explain why white is not even necessary when we're painting with watercolor, even though I know that a lot of watercolor sets include white paint, which makes things even more confusing for people just getting started. Watercolor is a translucent medium as opposed to opaque painting mediums such as acrylics, oils, and gouache. Yes, you're going to come across colors that are more opaque than others, but all in all, this medium is translucent, and we are working in combination, in unison with the paper underneath that paint and integrating even that lightness and that beauty of that paper under the paint, incorporating that as part of the piece, making use of it to develop our different values and translucencies to give our painting dimension and depth and glow. If we don't use that whiteness of the paper for our highlights or light areas that we plan, and we just cover up the entire surface of the paper, most likely than not, our painting is going to end up feeling heavy and we're going to fail to create a light, glowy painting, which is something that is specific to watercolor. When we're working with something like acrylics and oils, we're covering that surface up with thick layers of paint. We don't want that surface of the canvas or the wood or whatever it is that we're painting on to show. However, when we're working with watercolor, we do want it to partially show. And even though you can incorporate that beauty and the lightness of the paper in a variety of different ways when working with this medium, such as vignette style watercolor pieces, which have that paper showing all around the actual little piece. What I like doing and what many watercolor artists do is the highlights or the lightest areas in the painting are where you want that paper to show through. So that paper is going to stand in place for the highlights or the lightest values of whatever it is that you're painting. So this is why you're gonna often hear how it's so important to save those highlights or save those whites or work around the whites throughout the painting process, because these are areas that you don't wanna cover up with paint, right? If you cover them up, even with a very pale wash of color, you're most likely than not gonna be able to go back to the whiteness the paper once had. And thus, you're going to get rid of that lightest value, which is important in order to give something a sense of 3D-ness, a sense of form that you can reach out and touch. In order to give something a sense of three-dimensional form, you have to develop a wide range of values from very light lights, meaning highlights, to a wide range of midtones to very dark darks. And when working with this medium, as I just said, the highlights are the whiteness of the paper. For a lot of beginners just getting started with this medium, and this happened to me as well, is it takes a long time to get used to planning and saving the whites throughout the painting process. It's difficult, but as long as you stay mindful over time, you're gonna get better and better. And in time and with practice, you're not gonna have to bring in white gouache at the end all the time or a white paint pen, unless you plan for that, of course, but you're not gonna have to use them as a crutch because you covered up your highlights. Depending on the subject that you like painting and the style that you go for and even your way of working, you can consider starting to explore masking fluid, which is an awesome tool that I have talked about in the past and I've shared full tutorials on. I will also be linking to them down below in case you'd like to check it out. But masking fluid is an awesome tool because it allows us to create different textures, and it also helps us block out those highlights, and we can work a little bit more freely knowing that those highlights are saved for us. Right here in this painting process, you can see me working from lightest lights, and I'm making my way towards darker darks incrementally and in layers. So after taking my reference photo, I took time to observe it. I noticed my highlight areas. I planned for them in my preliminary sketch. You can even map them out for yourself so that you don't forget where they are as you're painting. And then you stay away from placing any paint in those areas, or make sure that it's a very, very, very light translucent wash. And then I move forward to incrementally develop darker midtones and darkest darks. Another thing that I want to make sure that you know about before I move forward with the tips is that today I am not going to be talking about color temperature or bringing in extra colors to add interest into our shadow areas or anything like that. So I intentionally worked on this study in a monochromatic way. You can see how I created a gray for myself. For this one, I decided to use a combo of indigo plus burnt sienna. And you can see how I use these two colors along the way to create my gray color mixture. If you see a little bit of a variation in temperature within this painting at the end, meaning some sections are a little bit more leaning towards the blue and others are leaning a little bit more towards the brown or the gray, it's because I am creating more of this gray along the way when it finishes, and I probably have slightly different ratios of my two colors in my color mixtures as I am moving forward. If I just used one ready-made black or even one same color all throughout this piece to create my different values, then I would probably just have one same temperature. But because I am using two colors in this case, one is cooler and one is warmer, then I am going to have slight changes in temperature. The burnt sienna is a reddish brown, so it's warm, and the indigo is a deep dark blue, which is cool. But again, as I said before, I would consider this piece to be monochromatic, and I am not very concerned about bringing in other colors to alter that color temperature in a more noticeable way, or bringing in more vibrant colors to add points of interest or anything like that. I think that really doing your best to observe your references or whatever subject it is that you have in front of you in real life so that you can distinguish subtle variations in temperature in shadow areas of your subject so that you can alter and just explore, play with the use of color temperature in your painting in accordance to what you're seeing in your subject. That is very important and very cool to do. But I think that what's number one for beginners is getting comfortable with the medium, understanding water control, and making sure that you're able to distinguish between different values, not necessarily color or color temperature, but I always recommend beginners focus on value first. What is darker, what is kind of within a mid-tone range, and what is lighter. Because value is really number one in terms of developing a sense of 3D form and depth in a piece. And whether a color is super correct is not really as important as getting correct values. And I think that after you've understood values and how to develop different values with a monochromatic piece, it's going to be a lot easier for you to start bringing in different color temperatures and exploring that. But I always recommend beginners take it a step at a time. And this is why I always, even to the day, love doing monochromatic pieces or grayscale pieces, such as this statue study that I also shared, I think a couple of weeks ago or last week, I cannot remember, but I always recommend monochromatic studies or grayscale studies for beginners. And then once you understand form, how to create a believable sense of structure at form and volume via these types of studies, then start worrying more about color, temperature, and all that. If you feel that you're already successful at creating a sense of 3D form and depth in a monochromatic piece or a grayscale piece, the main piece of advice that I would provide, especially when it comes to painting white subjects, is really taking time to observe your reference photo or whatever it is you have in front of you in real life and notice if shadow areas look warmer or cooler. Sometimes it's going to be super subtle, but what I would recommend doing is really focusing on that. Notice how the color changes in your shadow areas. Sometimes they're going to look a little bit more towards the cooler bluish purplish side, and other times they're going to be leaning more towards the warm side. And you can use this information to pick out different colors for each area. All right, so with all that out of the way, here are my top 6 tips for painting white objects or subjects with watercolor. So the very first tip is going to be to make sure that you're noticing the level of whiteness of the watercolor paper that you're using. Different brands offer different levels of whiteness of their papers. Some of them refer to their whitest paper as bright white, others as high white. But whatever it may be, I would recommend to give thought to that. How white and bright is the paper that you're painting on? Because some of them are going to be more off-white. So they're going to be maybe more yellowish or things like that, and it's not going to be as bright. And when we're painting something that is meant to look very white, it's really helpful to work on paper that is actually bright white, because this way you can ensure that those lightest areas are going to be super, super light and bright. This is going to help that subject actually look white at the end. Tip number 2 is going to be to make sure that you're creating a very, very light preliminary pencil sketch for yourself before getting started with your painting process. And this is especially important when you're painting white objects or subjects, because for the majority of the object itself, the washes that you're going to be using are going to be super light and translucent. So unless you want your pencil line work to show through your paint at the end, make sure that you create your sketch very, very lightly. Don't exert any pressure on your paper, and also if you find it helpful, you can always go in with a kneaded eraser before getting started with your painting process to lift up any excess graphite. That is something that I often do. Moving on to tip number 3, and this is so important, I cannot even begin to explain. Before actually starting with the painting process, make time to observe your reference photo or whatever it is that you have in front of you in real life that you're painting from direct observation. Don't get started with your painting until you have a pretty good understanding of where areas of highlights are, where midtones are, and where darkest darks are. If you find it helpful, you can even map out these areas for yourself in your preliminary outline sketch before getting started with the painting process. And make sure that the photo is a quality photo. If it's underexposed or overexposed, you're probably going to have trouble pinpointing those different values. Photos taken with flash, for example, are usually terrible because the flash flattens everything out and you're not able to see different value areas in the actual 3D structure of whatever it is you're drawing or painting. So don't make things harder for yourself and make sure that you're using a quality reference photo, or that you actually have something in real life in front of you that you're drawing or painting, and there is a good light situation in the room. If you're not able to pinpoint different value areas in your reference photo or whatever you have in front of you in real life, then it's going to be very hard for you to actually make them happen in your painting. Now, in the past, I've talked about how important it is to use references or, direct observation and actually observe. Use your observational skills to take in that visual information and not make things up. Because when we don't use references or whatever it is, then we're going to draw or paint things the way we think they look like and not what they actually look like in real life. So if you're looking to develop mid to higher levels of realism in your work, use references. Also, as I mentioned previously, if you're already past the beginner level, make sure that you also take note of subtle changes in color, temperature, and shadow areas before getting started with the painting process, so that you can start creating a strategy for yourself in terms of how you're going to be shifting and changing the temperature of different areas. Moving on to tip number 4, and this is going to be to consider making that background color darker. Because if the majority of the values in those largest areas in the actual subject itself are going to be on the lighter side, because if the subject is white, then that means that the subject's local value, overall value, is white, which is the lightest value of all. And yes, we're going to have to develop different values in that white subject to make it look 3D, but the majority of it is going to have very light values developed in it. This means that if we create a darker background color, or at least in some sections around that subject, we're going to create a nice contrast, and this is going to make that subject pop out. For this study that you're seeing me work on right now, you probably noticed that I started out by painting in that first layer of dark gray in the background using a negative painting technique. I decided to approach this painting in this way because, number one, I knew since the beginning that I wanted to develop a dark gray value all throughout the background to make these white espresso cups really pop out of the page at the end. But also having that gray value right there on my page as I started developing my lighter values in my espresso cups really gave me a kind of guide or a point to start, as opposed to looking at the entire white space in my page. If you already have somewhat of a darker value, or at least a mid-tone developed around in some place in your piece before getting started with developing the values throughout the white subject, you have something to compare these new values to, if that makes sense. It's easier to make sure that the washes that you're laying down are light enough and that you're actually making your way incrementally towards darker values within the actual subject, because you have that point of comparison. Remember that the way that we perceive different values, the level of lightness to darkness of different colors, is going to depend on the values around that area. In the white flower tutorial that I shared, I think last week or the week before, I also started out with the negative painting technique, adding in those greens around the actual flower before starting to paint the flower itself. Moving on to tip number 5, and this is going to be to make sure that you're using very light, pale, translucent washes of color or shapes of color as you're starting to develop your different values inside of your white subject. And alongside this, consider leaving larger white areas of paper unpainted when compared to other colored subjects that you probably leave smaller highlights in. Don't leave huge white areas to the point that you start to create flatness. Because it's important that you develop a variety of different values and that you are able to notice those subtle value changes so that you can create a sense of 3D form. But depending on the type of subject that you're painting and the style of your painting as well, you can probably get away with leaving a larger unpainted section of paper inside your subject. Or go in initially with the wet on wet technique like I did with this study today. I pre-wetted those larger areas with clean water before dropping in my color, and when I dropped in my color, I made sure to only drop it into the darker value areas so that that color transitioned into lighter value areas to the point that the lightest areas that I'm able to see in the reference photo have almost no paint in them at all. Whatever type of technique you decide to use, whether you're going in wet on wet or wet on dry, something that is key as well is making sure that you're constantly testing out your color mixtures on a scrap piece of watercolor paper to test out your translucencies before going into your painting with them. You can see right there on my left how I am constantly testing out my color mixtures and my level of saturation on that scrap piece of paper before using them in my painting. Especially in the beginning of your painting process, you want to make sure that the colors that you're going in with are very pale and translucent and watered down. And you're only developing those darker midtones and darkest darks in areas that really require those dark values. Okay, and finally, I want to share an extra bonus tip with you guys. So this one is going to be to try to create your own dark color mixture instead of going with a ready-made black or even something like a Payne's gray when you're working on monochromatic studies or are adding in a white subject into a background that has color. Try to create your own dark color mixtures. There are so many quote-unquote recipes that you can find out there, and I have a video on dark color mixtures as well that you can start exploring. But it's what I'm doing right here in this study. Instead of reaching for my black, I created my dark gray by mixing my indigo and my burnt sienna. And this in itself is going to help get you into the habit of mixing your own colors, which I know can be very overwhelming for beginners. But also, you're most likely than not going to create a more interesting looking outcome with a little bit more vibrancy and interest to it, as opposed to just using one same color all throughout, especially a black color, which blacks tend to be very neutral and dull. And the only times that I use black are when I actually add another color into the black to make it more vibrant and change its temperature. And if you're afraid that throughout your piece, your color is going to look very different because, of course, as your color runs out, you have to make more of it. And just like what I was mentioning before, the ratios of your two colors are most likely than not going to be always the same. But as long as you're testing out your color mixture on your scrap piece of watercolor paper and it's quite similar to the gray that you were using before, you're gonna be fine, and it's gonna add interest and a slight variation in color temperature throughout your piece. Getting comfortable with mixing your own colors is so important. And if you're looking to develop mid to higher levels of realism, it's super important that you start learning about color theory, the color wheel, and what happens when different colors get mixed together. All right, you guys, that is gonna do it for today's video. I really hope that you found some helpful nuggets in it, that you found it inspiring, and if you did, pretty please, I'd super appreciate it if you give this video a thumbs up and share with family or friends who you think would find it helpful as well. That really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and allows others to get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe so that I can see you next week for another video, and keep on creating. Bye guys!